Thank you for joining. I hope everyone is having a good Friday morning. Today we are having Professor Monique Marks, so we'll go just straight to it. I'll introduce her and then she will start her talk. So Professor Marks headed up the Urban Future Centers at the DUT until 2025. Her personal research focus was on urban safety and critical placemaking. She holds a doctorate in sociology and is also trained as a social worker and a certified health coach. She has authored 7 books and over 70 peer-reviewed papers. Over the past 8 years, she has developed a special interest in drug use disorders and drug policy. She, together with a team from TB HIV Care, directed South Africa's first opioid substitution demonstration program. This program has been fundamental in shaping government policy and implementation planning. She is one of the co-directors of Bellhaven Harm Reduction Centre, which provides medical and psychological services to roughly 500 homeless and low-income people who use drugs. This center is also a hub for research on drug use and for service learning across multiple disciplines. Professor Marks was the vice chairperson of the eThekwini Homeless Community, which is chaired by eThekwini Deputy Mayor. She sits on advisory committees for a number of international boards focused on public safety and public health. She is also the chair of the HSRC Press. Professor Marks, over to you.
Oh, okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for getting up so early this morning. And please excuse my voice. I've just had a great season of bronchitis. I'm going to do a presentation, and I think Skura said that we'll do questions at the end of it. So, yeah, I'll keep it to about 45 minutes, see how that goes. So Skura's introduced me, and I'm sure a lot of people are sitting there thinking, okay, this woman, we can't really make out what exactly she is. If you're feeling that way, it's because you're correct. And sometimes I do wonder myself what I am. I'll talk a little bit about my professional identity in a minute. But really, what I'm going to speak about today is something that architects and urban planners in particular are very familiar with. And that's the whole idea of placemaking, where essentially what we do is we create vibrant and inclusive places, mostly within public spaces, which allow for engagement, social connection, and sometimes economic vitality. And the aim of placemaking is really to revitalize underutilized spaces, to promote things like walkability and sociability, access, and to also encourage community participation and ownership in particular spaces. Now, all of us are familiar with placemaking, and I think those of us that are interested in access to the city, you know, spatial justice would all be interested in the issues around placemaking. But what I'm going to be speaking about is something slightly different. It's a form of placemaking, but it's called critical placemaking. And when we do critical placemaking, and I'll explain this in more detail later, it takes placemaking a little bit deeper. And really, when we do critical placemaking, we have much more of a concern with social justice, with equity, but also with changing power dynamics. So often when we engage in critical placemaking, we're looking at how do we profile or change the narrative around marginalized people? How do we address systematic inequalities in relation to space and how space is used? And, and how do we get different thinkings around marginalized people? So really the idea is to disrupt current narratives and possibly to disrupt practices that are marginalizing and discriminating. So, with that in mind, I'm going to talk a little bit about where I come from and a little bit about Bellhaven and how that's worked as a critical placemaking space. So, Kiara, I think we way down on the PowerPoint. Is it possible to go to the top again, to the first view? Okay, and then the next one. So that, by the way, is what the place, the critical placemaking space looks like that I'm going to be talking about. It's called the Bellhaven Harm Reduction Centre. It used to be called the Bellhaven Memorial Centre. I'll talk a bit about its history. We do not serve 500 people. We did do that when we were working during hard lockdown in the safe lockdown spaces. Now we cater to roughly 120 people on a daily basis. Kiara, you can go forward. Next one. Okay. So, often young people are very confused about what it is they want to do as they grow older. I think particularly people who are architects, often that's a decision made early on in life. Um, but generally people go into degrees with the understanding that this is what they're going to be for the rest of their lives. And we invest in this identity, this professional identity, I think predominantly because we spend so much time studying in that particular field. But I think what I wanted to just put into people's minds, not only about the conversation I want to have around what we did with Bellhaven as critical placemaking, but also to say we all reinvent ourselves. We are all more than one thing, and so perhaps that's why when Skuru read what I've done with my professional life, that it looked a little bit chaotic, and it is. So my last formal job, which ended in the beginning of March this year, I resigned from the Durban University of Technology, where I headed up the Urban Future Centre, which was based in the Faculty of Engineering and the Built Environment. That was financial suicide, but freedom on other fronts, which I won't get onto in this presentation. But my early beginnings were really in the field of social work. I trained as a social worker at Wits. I then landed up doing a lot of other stuff and particularly sort of had to put social work to bed for a while because it was a very demanding profession in terms of time and somewhat conservative as well. And I was at Wits at a time when I think activism was at its height. So became very much involved in the Congress movement, in youth politics, and I think that really had a massive impact on the way in which I understand the world. And I will come back to that in a minute because we made up not just by our professional identity, but by the range of experiences that we have as we navigate life. I then moved slightly laterally away from social work, did a master's in sociology, went to work for the African National Congress. Please don't kill me for that. That was in the good days of the ANC. I worked in public relations. Later then went into the world of the non-government sector at an organization called the Centre for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation. I was then offered a post in the sociology department. I was living in Joburg at what was then the University of Natal. And so shifted into sociology as a lecturer and then various other parts of the university. And there I started to be interested in much more in policing and the dilemmas of policing during the transition to democracy. And so I moved from social worker to sociologist to criminologist to urbanist and then into health, which is where I find myself now. And are these all so separate from one another? No, they're actually not. And hopefully this presentation will explain how the multidisciplinary space talks to one another, and how beautiful it is when we come together as transdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary groups to be able to impact on the environment. And when I talk about the environment, I'm talking mostly about the built environment in ways that really can impact philosophies, ways of seeing the world, paradigms, but also the way in which humans interact with one another and how they access social institutions. So, Kiara, next one. When I moved into the Urban Future Centre, I'd been working at the University of Natal in the School of Community Development and Social Work, in which, as people know, architecture and the built environment were located. I then was asked by the then Vice Chancellor of DUT, Ahmed Bauer, to move to DUT to establish the Urban Future Centre, which was kind of daunting. I'd never been an urbanist. I'd done stuff in the urban space, but mainly in relation to safety. And after being in that space, I don't think it was very long, maybe about 2 months, a group of people came to meet with me, and they were people who were living in what had come to be known as Wunga Park. Now, this was in 2014, where heroin use was beginning to explode, and mostly young heroin users had occupied a park, which became known as Wunga Park in the center of the city. But they were also congregating in public spaces outside of the park. Now, anybody who understands what Wunga is essentially a concoction, but the core drug within Wunga is heroin. And for anyone who knows anything about heroin, it is a sedative. It actually brings you down, um, calms you. It does have a little bit of give you a bit of a high as well. But it is not a stimulant. It's not the kind of drug that makes you hyper energetic and want to do a million things, right? So when people have taken Wunga or heroin, they tend to just go into a very sort of sedated, calm space. And yet, what had begun to happen is that the community around Wunga Park began to sort of blame any kind of criminal activity or social violence on the Wunga users. And so Wunga users began to be targeted, not just by the police, but community members who were beating up the Wunga users. And so they came to me and said, look, how do we find a way of people responding to us in a way that recognizes our human rights as people living in the city, but also gives them a little bit of insight as to the pathways into and out of drug use. Now, I knew very little about heroin use at this point, but I did know that it was incorrect to victimize an already highly marginalized group of people. In other words, people who are in active drug use and people that are homeless and are already vulnerable to police, vulnerable to a range of communicable diseases because of lifestyle issues and lack of access to healthcare facilities, and also vulnerable to stigmatization. And it became a little bit of more than just an interest area, more like a complete and utter obsession about trying to understand pathways into drug use, but also a concern with the human rights of people who use drugs, recognizing that drug use is a cry for help. It becomes problematic when there's already underlying trauma and disconnect in people's lives. And this is something that I started to really understand and wanted to um, sort of be able to present to other people so that there was more understanding around the pathways into drug use, the possible pathways out of it, but more importantly, recognizing that people who use drugs are very much part of the city, as is everybody else. But I wanted to understand more about what it meant to be an active drug user living on the streets. And so what I did is, and those of you that know anything about me, having spent many years as a criminologist, I work very closely with police across a range of different settings. And my way of understanding, I am an ethnographer, which means I immerse myself in the kinds of domains or situations that I'm trying to understand. And so it would have been very difficult to become a participant in Wunga Park without becoming an active heroin user myself. And so what I did instead is I got into the back of a police van and I started doing night shifts with the police, making sense of where it was in the city that people that were in active drug use were living, why were they being arrested, what was happening when they got arrested, and and just really making sense of the social phenomena in the city of Durban. Uh, and so what I began to see was really a group of people who were in need of assistance but were not getting it and were highly victimized because the city did not cater, did not provide any spaces of protection for people who were in active drug use. And so as people started being arrested because drugs are illegal, and even those drugs like cannabis that have been decriminalized, they have not been legalized, they've only been decriminalized. People were arrested, and I started having conversations with people in the back of the van. And as I was listening to people, about the terrible experiences they were having, not only in their lives prior to being in active drug use, but now living on the street in active drug use, there was a word that kept on coming up. And I kept on hearing this word, methadone, methadone, methadone. We need methadone. Now, all I knew is that methadone was a medication, but I didn't know anything more than that. And so I started reading up about methadone, came to understand that methadone is a Schedule 6 medication used to assist people in, I suppose, either coming off opiates, because it is an opiate substitute, so it has a similar effect on the brain, on the opioid receptors to what heroin has. But it's also used beyond what some people would call detox, something that is very controversial. I can speak about if people are interested. I don't really believe in it. But long term really helps people to maintain their lives, either through radically reducing their use of opiates or abstaining. And what I came to realize is that people in South Africa do not have access to methadone at all, not in the public sector. And it's very, very expensive on the private sector. And that's because the demand is so low. And one of the reasons that the demand is so low is because methadone and other opiate substitute medications are still not on the essential medicine list in South Africa, which means medical aids can't provide for methadone use beyond detox, and you cannot get methadone in the public sector. Even in critical care in hospitals, it's very difficult to get methadone. And so I went on this mission to say, we need to make methadone available in South Africa. And I started for the first time finding other people in South Africa that were interested in the same thing that I was. In particular, met up with a group called TB HIV Care. And together we started doing the work in beginning what was called South Africa's first low threshold opiate substitution therapy program. And by low threshold, simply what I mean is that there are very few barriers to access the program. And once people are on the program, it is very much centered on their self-determined goals. And if people leave, they are able to come back into the program without feeling stigmatized and marginalized, but rather with understanding of what led to their relapse or their leaving the program. And that began in 2017. I took a chance. I wrote to the Suppliers of Equity in South Africa, which was a UK-based group called Equity. I asked them, having no experience in this field at all, whether they'd be interested in funding this demonstration project. And lo and behold, within 2 weeks, the UK office got back to me and said, we're prepared to fund 50 people over an 18-month period so that we're able to document the efficacy of methadone in its local context in South Africa. Because although methadone has been on the market since the 1960s, in South Africa, we always have to prove that something works in South Africa, even though the evidence is abound globally. And so that is what we did. So that program ran for 18 months. And after that, we tried to work very closely with the city of Durban and, of course, with the National Department of Health, National Department of Social Development to say we need to get more programs like this running. That program ended in 2019. And from that point onwards, we were trying very, very hard to get a full-time methadone program and broadly to be able to provide harm reduction services within the city of Durban, but not just within the city of Durban, throughout South Africa. And we were met by a strong prohibition abstinence approach within the city of Durban, and it was a no-go. Even though there were people in some of the cities, departments such as health and safer cities that were keen, we weren't getting the traction. But then something amazing happened, and that was COVID. And COVID really provided the opportunity for us to begin really introducing this dream of creating what many of us had called an Africa Centre for Hope, a place where the most marginalised in our cities, homeless people with a substance use disorder, could have some hope of life normalization and of living a life free of stigma and massive health concerns. Now, in the 1970s, the early 1970s and 1973, Durban was the place where a Black labor movement began. The first Black trade unions really had their roots in Durban, and the early strikes that occurred in the early 1970s began in Durban, and this became known as the Durban moment. I use the word Durban moment with that in mind because for me, COVID represented the second Durban moment because Durban really did take the lead in terms of how to care for homeless people with a substance use disorder during COVID lockdown. Okay, next slide. I'll explain how that happened. So, as everybody knows, during COVID lockdown, all of us were told we needed to stay at home. We needed to prevent social contact as a way of stopping the virus from spreading. And so very strict emergency laws were introduced to ensure that people stayed at home. There were, as we know, limited opportunities to do shopping and to enter into the public spaces, almost zero. But of course, the municipality recognized that there were roughly, at a low estimate, about 8,000 homeless people living in the streets of central and sort of on the borders of central Durban. And the question was, what was home going to look like for these people who were also urban dwellers who could not go home? There was no home. And so within a week, the city started to develop scaffolding, and we started to develop a group of people were put together by the then Deputy Mayor Belinda Scott to say, let's deal with this quickly. Let's set up 13 what we called safe sleeping spaces for the homeless community, but let's also set up a program to be able to ensure that people who were going through withdrawal because they were no longer able to access their drug of choice, which in Durban, aside from cannabis, is mostly heroin-related products. How could we prevent people from going into mass withdrawal in the safe sleeping spaces? Now, this is really important for two reasons. If people were going into withdrawal, they would want to escape the safe sleeping spaces, go into the urban areas to find drugs, and therefore create a vector of transmission between the homeless population and the more formal settled population of Durban. I just want to just say something really important here, is that we did test in the two of the homeless safe spaces about a month into COVID lockdown, one in the Moses Mabhida underground parking lot, which is where I was stationed for the 10 weeks of lockdown running the methadone program. And then our second site, which was in Albert Park, where we also ran a methadone program. We did COVID testing, and there was not a single positive COVID result in that period, which meant that if there were vectors of transmission, it would have been from the formal community to the homeless community and not the other way around. And I think this is a very interesting lesson because it really turns on its head what common sense would have said to us. So we transformed these, what were public spaces, essentially, into a utility which provided some kind of respite, care, dignity for homeless people, I think, for the very first time in Durban's history. And it's for that reason that I refer to it as the Durban moment. But more specifically, the city allowed us to create a harm reduction approach to dealing with substance use, moving away for the very first time from a prohibitionist abstinence approach to dealing with substance use in this particular moment. Next slide. Kiara? Okay, so I just wanted to give a little bit of a picture about what COVID lockdown looked like in Moses Mabhida Stadium. There were roughly 250 homeless people living in the underground parking lot of Moses Mabhida Stadium, which is where we began our withdrawal management program, providing methadone, an opiate substitute, Schedule 6 medication to people that were in moderate to severe withdrawals. We had to do a test, which is called a CALS test, just to establish how severe the withdrawals were. But what you see here were the beds that people made and in the underground parking spaces. They were very neat, they were very dignified. Each person had a little mattress and a blanket. Some brought their own pillows with them, and boxes were used to store their own stuff. So it was really quite phenomenal. This is what home looked like for 10 weeks of lockdown in Moses Mabhida Stadium. Next slide. And this is a bigger picture view of what it looked like. That is the entire parking lot. The whole parking lot had these beds. And this is just a close-up view of two of the people that were living in the Moses Mabhida Stadium during lockdown in the underground. Of course, no natural lights, no natural air. It wasn't ideal, but it was very safe. And people were provided with ablution facilities, food, medical facilities, and of course the withdrawal management program, which we ran as a sort of private team coming into a public space. But you can see how dignified it was, even though it's very frugal in its setup. Next slide. Okay. And so for me, taking sort of my lead from Leonard Cohen in his song The Anthem, where he talks about how the light shines through the cracks and that nothing is ever perfect. But certainly, lockdown, COVID lockdown, was an opportunity for the light to shine through the cracks of what would otherwise seem like a very bleak situation. So, what did the municipality do? It allowed us to use public spaces, People's Park, the space next to the Jewish Center, Block AK, the Bellhaven Memorial Center, which was at that point just a much forgotten space which had once been used to care for street living young people. And then, of course, the Moses Mabhida Stadium, which is also a public space. But all of these were turned into something quite different. They were turned into a place of refuge where people were able to get access to housing, even though it was temporary, to a broad variety of social services, including psychosocial, be put back onto their chronic medications because most people had stopped that when they were street living. But this was only possible through creating what we call a quadruple helix, a partnership of the state, the non-state, academics, and the community itself in trying to come up with the solution. It took a lot of long nights to discuss how we could set that up in a way that the police felt comfortable with, that the city felt comfortable with, that us as service providers felt comfortable with, and that the community of substance users felt comfortable with. And it was so successful, that the city began to buy into harm reduction as a approach to dealing with substance use issues, particularly recognizing that methadone is an important medication that should be made available to people who are dealing with an opioid use disorder. And so in June 2020, the city handed over one of its buildings, the Bellhaven Memorial Building, and said, the Safer Cities Department, please, you guys, as a conglomerate of non-government organizations, and at that time, the Durban University of Technology, please make this into a permanent harm reduction center. And so we had hoped to call it the Africa Center for Hope. That had been our dream for many years. But the people, the beneficiaries of the center said, no, no, no. It's already called Bellhaven. We want to call it the Bellhaven Harm Reduction Centre. Next slide. And so the Harm Reduction Centre exists in an inner city suburb of Durban in Greyville. It is for people that are interested in urban design. It is on street level. You can walk straight from the street into the Bellhaven Harm Reduction Centre. It is directly across the road from Game City in Greyville, and next to the bowling club, in a mixed-use area. We were very, very concerned about how people would respond to, 150 active drug users coming for services to Bellhaven. And so we prepared people for this. But actually, there was very little antagonism, and we have only actually got support from the public. I'll speak more about that in a minute. So, what happens, or what was happening at the Bellhaven Harm Reduction Centre? Firstly, we provided harm reduction services, and I'll explain what those are. Those include an opiate substitution therapy program using methadone, providing clean needles and syringes to people who are still injecting in active drug use, testing and referral for TB and HIV, and also ensuring that people have access to paraphernalia, but also access to condoms to prevent the transmission of bloodborne illnesses, because harm reduction emerged really in the period where HIV became a central point for all public health issues. So we provided those services, psychosocial support, but also Bellhaven became a place where people could deliberate around homelessness, around what it meant to be an active drug user, around human rights violations, around public safety, around a variety of issues that were not being deliberated in the city. And it also became a place where people were able to become young entrepreneurs. If they were into, for example, art and design, we developed a studio. People who wanted to set up spaza shops could start deliberating on what that would look like in terms of developing plans and developing CVs. And then we also had a really interesting thing where the homeopathy department from DUT decided that they would also provide a service at Bellhaven. So we had both the allopathic, your general medicine, and your non-allopathic, your homeopathic services available at the Bellhaven Harm Reduction Centre. The first one, by the way, in the world where a homeopathy program runs from a harm reduction centre. Over here, you'll see a couple of photos. The top one, our nurse Eugene, who is from the DRC and has now moved to Canada, but an incredibly empathic person, providing services in a very dignified way. The little bottles that he's holding is the methadone, the medication that we give to prevent withdrawals and for people longer term to maintain themselves on either very low doses of illicit or abstaining from the illicit use of opiates. The middle one is our social worker outside of Bellhaven and one of our peer supporters talking to a client about managing their drug use. And then, of course, the third one is our nurse Carla taking bloods, checking for HIV, which obviously we do with the permission of our clients. Next slide. So really here, what I wanted to show is remember that we have this sort of semi-formal space where the city has given us a public space to use for psychosocial and medical services, but it really does interface on the informal because of the connection between the street, literally as a barrier, if you want to call it that, between harm reduction and the road itself, is the street as public space, but also our clients who are from the informal sector. You know, they are not linked up to the formal job space, recognizing how constrained our labor market is. And so often our social worker does her role not within the space of Bellhaven itself, but actually goes onto the street to talk to our clients about how they're doing in their lives as street living people, as people that are in active drug use, or as people that are on treatment. And so this is where the formal meets the informal. Next slide. Mostly for us, you know, what Bellhaven represents is a place where homeless people, and particularly homeless people with a substance use disorder, can come and receive dignified health. And this is because often when homeless people go to the public hospitals, they are highly stigmatized and often are just ignored, even in the public hospitals where they are supposed to be able to access healthcare. But more than that, when people who are in active drug use go to the hospitals, because opiate substitutes are still not on the essential medicine list, they go into withdrawals because they are not given the proper medication to stop the withdrawals, and they then abscond from the hospital because they'd only wait in the queues for up to 10, 12 hours a day, if you're lucky. And so the public hospitals have become, you know, really not very useful for people that are street living, rough living. So Bellhaven really does represent a space of hope and a space of care. Next slide. It's also a meeting point where people can talk about what could the city be doing to regenerate itself. Because, what we tried to do at Bellhaven is to say, let's stop trying to render homeless people and people with a substance use disorder as invisible. They are very much part and parcel of the city. And if we really want to talk about urban regeneration, if we really want to make the urban a place of dignity, a place that really is truly accessible to all, a place that allows us to talk about equal access, then we need to begin conversations about how do we change the urban to make it livable and to make it a space where people can receive services, feeling safe, destigmatized, and humanized again. And this is a conversation, a coming together of people from Bellhaven, together with people from the eThekwini municipality, to talk about what does Bellhaven represent, how could it be replicated, and what should be happening in the city to assist with homelessness and with drug use in the city. Next slide. Okay, here you can see some of our artists doing their work, allowing for what urbanists would call human flourishing, which seldom happens with street living people, again, because they're kicked to the margins and because nobody really wants to see them as people whose human flourishing is intricately linked to our human flourishing as other people that are more formally linked to city spaces. Next slide. Okay. Bellhaven is not just a place for deliberation and a place for accessing services. It is also a place where we practice tolerism, tolerance and multiculturalism. This is a beautiful example of our clients who are identify as following Islam. This is during Ramadan. We actually made the stage of the Harm Reduction Centre into a mosque where people who were fasting during the month of Ramadan could come and pray. We also made sure that they were able to take their methadone outside of the fasting hours to try to accommodate our Muslim clients. Most of our clients are from the Christian faith, but we do have people from all faith groups. And we really want Bellhaven to be a place where this is not only recognized, but supported. Next slide. And when we moved into Bellhaven, it was a total wreck. And the city, we met with them and we said, look, we can't operate in this space. It's a total disaster. The ceiling was caving down, paint hadn't been done, toilets were not working, electricity supply had been cut off. But more importantly, for the last 8 to 10 years, the taxi industry had been living inside Bellhaven. And by the way, they continue to take up about a third of the space in Bellhaven. So we run Bellhaven together with the taxi industry living in our building. I'll answer any questions about that later. It's a fairly interesting thing. But the city realized if they really wanted to continue to own the space and develop a partnership with us as the non-government sector, including the university, they needed to invest. And they invested just under, I don't know, I think at the time it was about 800,000 to try to get the building to a place where it was habitable and usable. It wasn't good enough. We then got another organization called the Dates Foundation, who came in and assisted in getting Bellhaven to where it is today. Next slide. Okay, just so that people know, our partner organizations obviously our public health organizations, Advanced Access and Delivery, then the Urban Future Centre at the Durban University of Technology, TB HIV Care, I've mentioned them, the South African Network of People Who Use Drugs, because we wanted them as a representative organization of our beneficiaries to be part of this, and they've played a very important role in advising how we set up our services. The Dennis Hurley Centre, which everybody knows is probably one of the biggest providers of care to homeless people in the city of eThekwini. And then, of course, the municipality had to come on board. They provided the building, free electricity when it works, and water when it works, and 24-hour static security, which is totally useless and a waste of money, but nonetheless. Next slide. The role of government has been very little in a way, because they have provided the building and the static security. They really don't provide any funding for Bellhaven. I suppose, if anything, they provide moral support, which is more than we thought we would get prior to COVID lockdown. Believe it or not, our greatest allies from the municipality are the Metro Police, who have been on board with us from the very beginning. And for those of you that are architects, what we did when we first started Bellhaven is we said to the police, we are bringing you on as architects of the space because you understand the streets easier, more than anybody else does, and you have to police the space. So we brought them on and we called them architects, and they were very much involved in the design of Bellhaven right from the get-go. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. So I sort of want to end with why it is, I think this may be the last slide, why it is that Bellhaven Harm Reduction Centre is a placemaker, but more important, is a critical placemaking space. And there are many reasons for this. Firstly, as I've mentioned before, it is a place where beneficiaries, people that are homeless and otherwise and low income and have a substance use disorder, that are generally kicked to the pavement, literally and figuratively, have now come to see that there is hope, that they can reconfigure their lives, that they can begin to normalize their lives, that they can begin to have hope of moving beyond where they currently are. Being located in a mixed-use neighborhood meant that people, both working and living in the neighborhood, were able to engage with the clients, the beneficiaries of Bellhaven, but also the staff, who could speak about, what is drug use? How does this happen? Why is this not something that is just about homeless people? So really to begin to engage and to begin to shift narratives. And so people who were not part of Bellhaven itself started wanting to learn more about drug use, started coming to our public meetings, which we hold regularly, learning more about drug use, more about methadone, more about street living. And so when we have days like, Homeless World Day, we are packed out. People come, to learn more. And so the narrative around homelessness and drug use has begun to change, more empathy. And as people see how having access to the right health can transform people's lives, the narrative around abstinence and prohibition has transformed as well. And people are now speaking about harm reduction as something which is positive rather than something which is problematic. So this open experiment has led to not only an improvement in service provision to a very marginalized grouping, but far more broadly, new conversations around homelessness, around drug use, around access to the city. It could not have happened without the quadruple helix, which I've already spoken about, without being creative, without bringing other people on board. And the result has been that we have created a frugal institutional setup, which is very impactful. And for that, we have won a number of awards of recognition from both nationally, locally, and internationally. There may be one last slide, and I will then conclude and open up for questions. Kiara, I don't know if there's one. That's it. That was the team of Bellhaven when we began. It's now slightly different. And so from those of us who are still part of Bellhaven, thank you very much to all of you for inviting me. This is a bit of a left of side presentation, I think. But I do think Bellhaven is an example of what we can do in the cities, to transform not the landscape, but also the way in which people who live in the city think about one another, and how marginality can actually change from being on the periphery to being right in the center. I was asked to speak for roughly an hour. I've spoken for about 50 minutes, and I guess now we can open up. I see there are some questions, so I'm not sure who wants to field those.
Thank you so much, Prof.
No
Very,
worries.
very interesting. I think today you've educated us about the very important part of our job as architects,
Mm,
which is people. That's the most important part of our
yeah,
work. To understand people, to understand our city,
yeah,
and to understand the dynamics. With that, there's one question I wanted to ask. This the stigmatization for people living in the street with public health specifically. Do you feel that as South Africa, if we, in handling that, we are in denial of our true environment or reality? Because we some of us are living in a very cocooned environment, and we actually are not aware of what's really happening on
mm,
the street, because we are very we're in a very unequal society. And obviously, as an architect, this could lend you to very, very embarrassing conclusions in trying to design public health if you are
yeah.
not aware of these environments. What do you think of us just ignoring that and being ignorant of um, catering for everybody?
Yeah, yeah. So thanks, Guru. I mean, you just think about your daily lives when you're driving and there's someone at the traffic light and they're looking for some kind of support, usually in the financial terms. Um, and what is the common reaction? The common reaction is irritation, or uh, or it could be anxiety, or it could be I just don't want to engage with this. Like this person's not existing. So what we tend to do is we tend to try and block people out, because what homelessness does, if we see it, if we look at it in its face, is that it really makes us confront the social realities of our lives. And the social reality is that the majority of people live in sub-economic, spaces, not just the street, but informal settlements, hostels, and a variety of other places, and many parts of them, even the formal parts of townships too. And we tend to not see these as important places. And yet, if we engage with people who live in these spaces, they understand the city very well, but they also understand the underbelly of the city, which most of us don't. And I think if we took a little bit of time to understand the lived realities of what I think are actually now becoming the majority of people living in our cities, it would transform the way in which we design, because we would design with a conscience. And you're totally right, Skuru. We do, in medicine, people speak about people-centered medicine. There are architecture schools around the world that talk around about people-centered architecture. But really, what they're talking about is more of a participatory form of architecture, not necessarily an architecture that is directed at sort of reducing and preventing marginalization. I think this is a real challenge to architecture schools, but also to, the legal profession is extremely good at pro bono work. They do it for a number of reasons. But architecture firms are not so great at pro bono work. And I really think it's in spaces like this that pro bono should be coming to the surface. And really to be people centered means getting yourself into uncomfortable spaces and having conversations with people that you generally wouldn't have conversations with, like the homeless population, and finding out what does space mean to you? When does space become safe? Why do you choose? People will know how overly populated the underground, the area below the Brook Street bridges. And people don't really know why that is. Well, if you ask people who live underneath the bridge why they live there, it's because it's so difficult to police that part of the city. And so it's a safe space for people to live, right? Our social workers go under the Brook Street Bridge to provide services to our clients, but the police don't. And so our clients know that, right? And so, what could we be doing in places like that? How could we transform that from a place of total squalor and lack of dignity to something else? But that requires imagination and investment.
Thank you, Prof. It brings me to my second question on whether the question of COVID um, asked the city and society in general in Durban or in South Africa as well, whether we have adequate housing for everyone
Yeah,
or our method of housing, because all of a sudden now you have to house a number of people because of the COVID regulation and all of
yeah,
that, which is why people ended up at the basement of Moses Mabhida.
yeah.
How does it in your mind fit into the whole discussion on providing housing, etc.?
Okay. Well, I mean, a couple of points that people may not know. Durban does not have a single public shelter at all, except one now, which is sort of public, not entirely, called Strollers, which is only for women and children. It's actually owned by Urban Line, but they've given it to the city to use for that purpose for now. Other than that, we do not have a single public shelter in Durban. We have now these tent structures which the city has at behind the Jewish Club and at Block AK, but that is it. There's no other, and they're just tented structures. Ablution facilities don't really function anymore there, so it's really problematic. And no local governments anywhere in the country have an allocated budget for homelessness. So just bear that in mind, because I think it's really important. We are trying to create a pressure group to ensure that there are budgets for homeless people in the city. That still has not come to fruition. And so it's a serious, serious problem. Um, Made worse by the fact that, as we all know, our economy is getting worse, Screw, and as our economy gets worse, more and more people will become homeless. And we do not have what exists out in other parts of the world, for example, like Canada, where they say housing first, deal with the health problem second. And they're quite correct in that, because so long as you don't have a stable space to live, regardless of how nominal it is or how basic it is, it's very difficult to rescaffold your life. And then the second point is where there are no opportunities for generating an income and feeling like you're part of a society. I would wonder, is it worth stopping being in active drug use, because there's not a lot of hope about regaining your life. And these are realities that we need to understand about the city that we live in.
Thank you so much. May I please open the floor now to any questions or comments that people may have? I think you partly answered my other question because I wanted to find out the in your research the relationship between drug use and a stable place of living. You know, the relationship
Uh,
between yes.
Sorry, say that again.
The relationship between drug use
Yeah,
and a place to stay. Do you
yeah.
find more people who do not have a stable place to stay more likely to continue using drugs?
Yes, no, absolutely right. So let's just talk about why people start getting into problematic drug use in the first place. I'm very conscious about how I speak about drug use. All of us are substance users in some way or the other, whether it's cigarettes or alcohol, coffee, I don't care what it is, sleeping pills, antidepressants, whatever. We're all in active drug use. Um, but when it becomes problematic is when drug use becomes the salient part of your life. In other words, the main part of your life. Everything else circles around that. And when people are in problematic drug use, it's generally because drug use is a problem to already existing, a solution to already existing problem. Drugs itself are not the problem. The problem is beneath the drug use. And those problems are usually, if you speak to people who have a substance use disorder, they will have experienced a high level of trauma at some point in their lives, or they would have been disconnected from significant others. Very few people will not have that as part of their narrative. And so that creates a sort of link between a substance use disorder and unstable or rough living, because people get kicked out of home, or they leave home because that's where the trauma is, or because they don't want to re-traumatize people. And so there's a high correlation between homelessness and substance use. However, I do want to make the very clear point that that substance users exist across all social strata. And now that I'm in private practice, I am dealing a lot with substance users from middle to high income categories. But their stories are not different. They have still had some traumatic incident happen in their lives. It's just that they're more protected from the police and from the kinds of stigma which homeless people have through living in stable housing. But yes, absolutely. Once people have a home, a place that they can have home, that's the beginning of life normalization. And it is really critical, and we don't have that, not only in the city of Durban, but actually throughout the country.
Thanks for that. Mike?
Morning, Monique. Thanks so
Morning.
much for absolutely fascinating, I don't want to say lecture, but it was a conversation. Helped us so much.
Thank
Your
you so
comment
much,
about Bellhaven and the Taxi Association reminds me, and I don't know whether Richard Dobson is on this program, but many years ago we were doing projects with the city, and we looked at a social responsibility project linked to a major capital project. In other words, the contractor and the professional team who are involved in the major development would participate in a social responsibility project to assist with, as you say, pro bono. The contractor would be at basic, no markup, etc., to donate to get something done.
Mm.
One of the ideas that came amongst everything, and not a hell of a lot came, it ended up developing a indoor sports centre up in the mayor's home district, which was a bit irritating. But one of the thoughts that came to mind was the use of the taxi shelters at night for homeless people as a shelter. And I don't know whether, and the concept of mobile clinics, perhaps visiting there, and food services and things like that. I don't know whether that's ever gained any traction. Thank you.
Look, it definitely hasn't come into the conversations that we have been having, and definitely I've not heard much about it. Even, there's a homeless platform at the moment nationally, and it's definitely not surfacing there, which doesn't mean that it's not happening. It just means that it's not hitting the groups that are most active in this space. So perhaps, Paul, it's something to, find a way of putting on the agenda. The Taxi Association are interesting. They're a very powerful group, as you know. It's taken us a long time well, not a long time, but it's taken a lot of energy to navigate arrangements with them, which are mutually respectful, because they actually also do run the heroin trade in Durban, a lot of it. And so, we've had to say to them, we understand there's a market. We can't stop the market, but please don't run the market at Bellhaven, because, that's going to create a lot of problems for our clients that are trying to reduce or abstain. And they've continued to sell. They prey off the vulnerability of homeless people. So there's some contradictions. But there's another side to it as well, is that, many taxi drivers and owners are themselves engaged in active drug use. And so they have they have a supportive side as well with us. And they do protect our space, you know. I mean, it's a kind of a weird thing. They can destroy our space, but they can also protect it. And that's because, you know, they realize that they are also dependent on us running the space. So there've been some threatening moments from both sides. But it's all about conversation, Paul. It's all about conversation and how do people mutually benefit from these unusual relationships. And we have a very unusual relationship with the taxi industry. But we have a sort of a social contract which allows us to navigate that space. It's not always that simple. And I actually can't even say it's simple at Bellhaven, but it works. But it takes very strong personalities to be able to engage with the taxi bosses and say, you know, what would you gain out of making, you know, the taxi ranks a space where places of refuge for homeless people. What could homeless people do to support the taxi industry? We see these things happening all over the place in the city, by the way. It's not unusual. But, you know, some shop fronts, for example, allow homeless people to sleep in front of them at night where there's an awning. But there's an arrangement there. They protect the space at night. And I think those are progressive shop owners. And it is impressive. So, you know, if we can facilitate those kinds of conversations and outcomes, it's a win-win, really.
Sorry, just a bit of a blush. When I talked about a project, it was several years ago, probably 20 years ago.
Oh, wow.
So, which was not that long ago. But yeah, so perhaps it was in the discussion. That was when it was being discussed.
Yeah.
So
but it's a great idea. I like it. And it really should be one that is sort of resuscitated.
Thanks, Mike. Siko? Siko, you may proceed with your comment.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I was trying to. Okay, I see. Yeah, great presentation, Monique, and thank you for just telling the human side of the lives of people that I think most people don't want to see. Right. I just wanted to understand what active role should local government be playing, because I think it's they're quite a critical stakeholder. So what can they be doing now, not in the next general elections or next local government elections or pre or post? What are some of the key things that you see levers that could assist in the work that you're doing, that local government should be doing? And I'm not just talking about here in eThekwini, but perhaps in other cities as well. So that then becomes a template to how local government should be assisting in delivering or playing a role in assisting such initiatives. Thanks, Monique.
Yeah. No, thank you, Siko. And for people that don't know, you know, Siko has probably been one of the people that have, you know, raised the flag for homeless people and still is doing that, even much more so than I am currently. So, Siko, just to answer your question, look, firstly, we are solely dependent. And when I talk about we, I'm talking about all of us involved in homelessness, whether we're providing, you know, programs around substance use or housing or anything else, with no investment from the city at all or from national government. So, you know, what that means is that it's precarious all the time, because really, you know, what the city has done in, for example, Durban, they've just given a building and then that's it. That's their contribution, right? And we've come under threat, as you know, Siko, because of the funding constraints. We've had to suspend the methadone program about 2 years ago and now again, because, you know, funding has become a real problem. And we keep on saying to the city, you know, this is important. You get mileage. You go around telling people about this amazing program, but you refuse to invest in it. So actual monetary investment at the local level is really important. But, you know, we also have to remember that a place like Bellhaven operates in the inner city, but substance use is a problem all over the city, both in the urban and the peripheral spaces. And they, people have said we need more Bellhavens, we need more places like this. And so the city should be saying, how can we do this in other parts of the city in a way that's frugal, that doesn't take a lot of money, learning from the way that we've done it, but make a serious investment in this. And as long as we have had these conversations, Siko and I, you and I have been part of these forums for many, many years, the needle has really not moved significantly at all. Not at all. And so the provision of housing, regardless of what that is, that's been on the plan, to have these, safe sleeping spaces that are a bit, more formal than what we currently have. That hasn't happened. That should be happening. Investing in housing for homeless people is a priority. And for those people that don't know, if you're homeless, you cannot be put on a housing list, even to get any form of social housing at all. That needs to change. The bylaws around what it means to be homeless needs to change, so that loitering is no longer a crime. And I do think that government, not only local and provincial, but nationally, needs to decriminalize all drugs, so that people are able to seek help and to be able to lead dignified lives. So there's so many interventions, Siko. The housing one is one that we are acutely aware of. But it's not just that, it's also investing in health-related spaces like Bellhaven, and Bellhaven's by far not the only one. Otherwise, we become dependent on international donor funding that has huge constraints to it, but also a lot of red tape, which makes, doing the more kind of spontaneous responses almost impossible. So thank you for that question, Siko. It's a long-term mission that doesn't seem to be going very far.
Thank you so much, Siko, and thank you, Monique, for the response. Now, I wanted to ask also about your perception of the substance abuse versus crime. I know in South Africa we have a huge problem of crime in general. A lot of it is organized crime, in fact. A lot of people who do crime, need resources, they have cars and all of that. And in this particular situation, in the space that you've worked with, the correlation between substance abuse and crime, because I mean, South Africa crime is a huge thing.
Yeah. Look, let me talk about organized crime in the first place, right? And I just want to debunk a myth very quickly. If you're a heroin user, chances of being able to organize any crime is pretty low. So you'll find that heroin users, when they are in withdrawal, they will be engaged in crime, but it's more petty crime like theft. So we need to also understand what are the different drugs that are being used and what is the impact. If you are using a stimulant like meth, then you may become more aggressive, and there will be a link between that form of drug use and crime. But I don't think that we should be looking at people who use drugs as the primary people behind crime. I don't think that it's true. No, and unfortunately, crime statistics are very complicated because drug use itself is a crime. And so they talk about drug-related crimes, which is anything that has some kind of drug use associated with it. But I think we need to be very cautious about this immediate association with drugs and crime. There is some connection, but it's not the full story. And I would say that it's not even the biggest story. Having said that, what is common between the growth of crime and the growth of drug use is inequality. Because, so long as you do not have access to a way of making an income that is able to sustain you and the significant people in your life, either you're going to blunt that reality by engaging in substance use, or you're going to engage in criminal activity as a way of gaining some kind of livelihood. And, very interesting story. Many years ago, when the Architecture International Association happened in Durban, we had a visitor from Colombia, and he asked me what the unemployment rate was in South Africa, and I told him. And he said to me something which I'll never forget. He said, if your unemployment rate is that high, you don't have a crime problem. Because what else do you expect people to do at the level of unemployment that you have? I think it's something that we need to really, really take to heart. And it's one that has stuck with me for a very long time.
That's very significant. Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Monique. Any other comments or questions? So it's actually amazing. Just before you come in, Kevin, it's actually amazing then, Prof, that we continue to invest in infrastructure and other things in the city, but we actually are not looking into problems that affect our own humanity or humanness, or just making sure that the person in the city is taken care of. It is interesting because I mean that's what SECO was speaking about in terms of our budget. It's not like there is no budget at all. We are just not prioritizing.
Yeah, totally correct. Totally correct. I see Kevin's hand is up and Marita.
Yeah, my hand's up. I don't know if you
Kevin,
can hear. I was
then
trying to
Marita.
get my video on, but yeah, I'm not allowed to. Hi, Monique. Thanks for fantastic talk. And I hope I hope I didn't put you off Architects for Life, having worked with you on your own place many years ago. Just a few points I want to raise, and thanks for an excellent talk. And perhaps you and I can talk because I have been involved in rehab centers in the past, not only in this country, but so I could talk for ages with you about that. But the points I wanted to make relate to the questions that have been asked on the chat. I wanted to say, as per your talk, Monique, anything is possible, and you've shown how you can change things with interaction and work with others. But Dim's raised the point earlier about CPD points, and that can be achieved. So I've sent him a message in the background just saying, get hold of me. SACAP can make changes and will make changes if motivated, and I see a way forward with that. And I think someone raised the point about pro bono work, and that has been discussed at council level before. I think it will be enacted sometime soon. Yeah, I don't know if you've heard any of that.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, anything's possible.
Yeah, no, you're right, Kevin. But a quick response to that, anything is possible, and we need to constantly be imagining outside of what's directly in front of us. However, I do want to say, that things become tricky when you left to try and maintain institutions and organizations like this with very little support. And I'm talking about financial support. So, it does become a tricky thing. And that's when you start seeing, there's transitions and transient nature of these kinds of interventions when they're not formally supported by government. And so really we have to ask the question, what is the role of government, in terms of providing public goods? We know that they can't provide them on their own, but at least engage in a proper relationship where you recognize the private public, with the public being in many ways the group that has to provide the infrastructural support and also assist with relevant connections. And trying to get that is not that easy. But the more we come together as people that are concerned about inequality, I think the better it is. Although, and SECO would know this well, those of us that have been in the space, it's exhausting, and it's tireless. And I know for myself, that now I feel like I need a bit of, respite, and now trying to manage the private world is complicated. So yes, we need to imagine together, and we need to support each other, and we need to make government accountable.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marita?
Morning, Monique. Thank you very much for the very informative talk. I'm wondering if you can hear me. Okay. So, is there a way that we can contact you to take the conversation further after today's presentation?
Sure. I mean, Kiara's got my number, Skura's got my number, Siko's got my number, and my contact details. Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks very much.
No,
I'll send you an email.
Great.
Thanks,
Thank
Marita.
you.
Manisa?
Thank you. Thank you, Skura. Greetings, everyone. Thanks to Prof. Monique for your presentation. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And just to concur that government gets away with a lot. So I agree. And perhaps it should just be a suggestion or proposal, Skura, that these type of conversations need to be taken forward, especially by the institution providing support for such conversations, because it has been brought to our attention. We've always known that there's always problems and challenges with the homelessness, but people like Prof and Siko and others who are doing something in that space perhaps could be supported by getting the parties that could change the situation or support better, like municipality and government, into a round table. So it mustn't just be perhaps a presentation in the practice breakfast space. We've done that before, where we had a conversation and then it ended up being a session, a follow-up session. So in such conversations, we could maybe consider such an approach, because we know that some of us here in this platform have access with particular municipality officials or government. So if it's a corporate voice, such as an institution, as an institute, as well as other professionals, I think it will go a long way. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. And we've tried to engage the business chamber in Durban, other corporate entities. It's quite a difficult thing to do, Mandisa, but there certainly is attempts to do that, and we've tried to do that. To be honest, the only group that have come on board has been the Dates Foundation. But you're absolutely right. That is what needs to be happening. I do also want to say that there are, people in the city, officials and practitioners who really are trying to make change. And I think that they're equally confronting these blockages. What I think COVID did teach us, for those of us that were involved in this, like Siko, is that when the city wants to, they can overrule the red tape, and they can do some quite amazing stuff, like freeing up 3 places and getting the scaffolding for dealing with homelessness effectively in a very quick matter of time. But that takes good leadership. And unfortunately, we've lost Belinda Scott. We don't have a very strong municipality at the moment, although there are some excellent people in the municipality. But it's that kind of leverage, that kind of tenacity, and commitment that's going to shift the city. But it's in short supply.
Sorry, Skura, just a quick follow-up on that. You find that you asked the question if government is doing enough. You find that if we had a media person in this platform, they could write an article, not to bash the municipality, but to amplify the efforts that you're making. And that will give a nudge, some sort of pressure to the officials to also come on board, because it needs that consistency that you worked with Belinda Scott at some point, but there's new leadership perhaps that some are not aware or are ignorant to the fact. But maybe we look at also media who can write a story on this, you know, and then that will give a nudge to highlight the positive that you're doing. But the officials always want to get on board when they see that there is some exposure, which won't be negative, but in a way it will create some sort of publicity. Thank you. Thank you, Skura. Back to you.
Yeah, I mean, we've had a lot of publicity around Bellhaven, especially in the early phases, and the city really wanted to take the limelight, you know. And we gave it to them because, you know, it's true, they did allow us, they did provide the building and the water, electricity, static security, for what it's worth. But I think where you're right, Mandisa, is that, you know, there is a new there's a new group within the city to some extent in terms of elected officials, and they do need to be reached out to. The bureaucrats remain the same; those haven't changed. That's the way government works. Bureaucrats stay; they have a lot of power, and the political officials, they come and go.
Thank you so much, Monique. Any last comments or questions? We truly appreciate we will be in touch, Monique, in your efforts. We as the institute, we like to partner with such efforts. We've done so with city people before, in just looking at their entry-level accommodation, trying to bring together a brief for them to look for funding. In the city, would like to partner with you as well, in any way we can as the institute. Before we are architects, we are citizens of Durban and South Africa, and we definitely like to make a difference in any way we can. Just your last words before we close.
No, I mean, it's just you know, I think architects and town planners are at the center of how we imagine space, right? But I think there are too few conversations around how do we imagine space with the right people in the room. In other words, the people that are most affected by exclusion. And that I think would be a useful conversation to have, you know, when we think about, you know, creative ways of doing mapping, and when we talk about how we include you know, social architecture in a very real way into the sort of architecture syllabus. I think it's still at a very, very, very low level. I don't think it's taken seriously enough. And just to go back to your initial point, Skuru, you know, that people are at the center, not just of architecture, but of planning and of engineering. And if we plan without the voices of people, and we design without the voices of people, often what we do is rendered not useful. And I think that for me is the critical point. We see a lot of bridges that are not used, people walking under bridges, for example. That's just you know, a sign of non-engagement and a waste of money. And so we need to put ourselves into uncomfortable spaces, speaking to people that we don't usually engage with. And I think that that's particularly important as well for people that are going through the training program at universities. So for those of you that are from university spaces, I think this is critical. And, you know, I came in here a little bit, well, I wouldn't say anxious, but like, you know, I'm not an architect. I'm not even an urban designer. I find myself in that place. But I think the fact that people find it interesting is because there is a huge sort of, how would I put it, alignment between the humanities and the built environment. And we need to be making that more apparent, because we keep separating them. You know, whereas something like architecture is highly philosophical by nature. You know, architects love philosophy, they love history, but they don't engage with sociology and with the social sciences adequately. And I think, you know, there should be more possibilities for that. Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Monique. So we will be in touch and just see how we can collaborate further in the future.
Okay.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
Corey. Thanks, everyone. Have a great Friday and a great weekend.
Thank you. Cheers, everyone. Take care.
Bye.
Cheers. Thanks, Monique. Bye.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.
Bye. Well said about engaging with sociology.